Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with David Toomey, who is a professor of English at University of Massachusetts Amherst, also the author of a whole bunch of books. Most recent book is called Kingdom of Play: What Ball-bouncing Octopuses, Belly-flopping Monkeys, and Mud-sliding Elephants Reveal About Life Itself. You also got a couple other books, one called Weird Life, The New Time Travelers, and Storm Chasers. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
So I enjoyed this book. It's a book, I would call it a book about evolutionary biology, or maybe ethology, or maybe affective neuroscience. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different academic areas that come together in this study of play, because there is no such discipline as playology, or right, the study of play. And I guess maybe the first question I'd have for you is, I mean, would it make sense to have something like playology? I mean, you mentioned that there's it's an area that's sort of understudied, but it seems to cross almost all animal lines. I don't even know where it ends. You say maybe even insects do a little bit of play, and hopefully, I don't know if bacteria get into the mix or not, but it does seem to be something that's pervasive and yet very, very difficult to define. So do you think we should maybe have a more coherent study of play? Does it warrant that kind of effort on the part of researchers?
I had never thought of the word playology, but I like it. And I would think a number of the scientists I wrote about and I spoke with do think, yes, a more holistic understanding of play is merited.
Yeah. Well, I guess the first part is, trying to define it. I think a big chunk of the book is just trying to figure out, right, what play is. And I think, you don't cite Justice Potter Stewart, but I think you probably could have. It's kind of something that we know when we see it, or we think we know it when we see it. But it's very difficult to distinguish it from other kinds of activities, right? You mentioned stereotypies, I guess, sort of the kind of repetitive behavior of animals in captivity. I mean, that's not play because it doesn't look like a whole lot of fun. And then, exploration, I don't know where the boundary line is there, because that seems to be something that's also kind of fun, but has a very direct purpose, whereas play seems to be something that is purposeless or, done for its own sake. I mean, how do we define play? Is there a coherent explanation, coherent definition?
Well, many ethologists have tried to come up with one. The one I land on in the book is Gordon Burkhart's. And Gordon Burkhart identifies 4 features of play that he says are unequivocal and do distinguish it, or allow us to distinguish it from other behaviors. So they are the behavior of play in no way assists an animal's reproduction or its survival. The behavior of play is voluntary. That is, an animal cannot be forced to play. If you're forcing an animal to play, it's by definition not playing. An animal plays because it wants to. Another, and you alluded to this, is stereotypies. Stereotypies are that repeated behavior typical of an unhealthy animal, a wolf pacing in its cage, for instance. Now, a playing animal may repeat its movements, but they will be varied. So consider a pony frolicking in a field. It may throw its head back again and again, but it will throw its head back in slightly different ways, in different positions. So the movements are repeated, but they're varied. And finally, Burkhart says, play occurs in an animal only when the animal is well fed and safe and well rested. So a tired or hungry animal, or in any way an animal that's being made terribly uncomfortable, is unlikely to be playing. So all those put together define play. And you brought up the question of exploration and play. One way to separate exploration from play is an animal exploring its environment or exploring something will conclude its exploration and decide that's all I'm going to, that's all. Now I'm comfortable, I've sufficiently explored it, we're done with that. But there's no clear endpoint to play. An animal stops playing only when it's tired of playing or becomes interested in something else. So yeah, so all of that together may be sufficient to define play.
Right, but I mean, it does seem like younger animals engage in a lot more play than older animals, right? And so it would seem to be something to do with learning and exploration, right?
It would. And the adaptive advantage of play is its teaching. And yes, younger animals on the whole do play more than older animals. Human animals included.
Right. So it could be it's a fun version of learning, right? So when learning is not fun, it's not play. When learning is fun, it's kind of like play. And look, play is not obviously good for you evolutionarily. I mean, you discuss in the book a couple examples of animals that are predated and eaten while they're engaged in play, right? Because they're not paying attention to their surroundings and so, you know, if it's not obviously good for you, but it has to be good for you because nothing makes sense except in the light of evolution. There seems to have been theories about the evolutionary purpose of play going all the way back to Darwin and his co-authors and students and Herbert Spencer and all of those folks, right?
Right. Yeah. The adaptive advantage of play, it's the reason natural selection selected play is one of play's mysteries. It would, as you just said, it can be very dangerous. It takes time and energy that better spent in other activities, and so on and so forth. So evolutionary biologists assume that these disadvantages must be outweighed by advantages. Now, what those are is a deep and enduring question. And the two long-standing hypotheses, and these are commonsensical. I think this is what anyone would answer you if you ask the question, why animals play. One is that it's training for adult behavior. That is, we're learning how to explore or hunt or mate, etc., in our play. The other is that it's socialization. That is, for social animals anyway. Consider wolf cubs. Wolves need to play together if they are to learn to cooperate, and they need to cooperate if they are to take down an animal larger than themselves, like an elk. A wolf can't do it alone. Thus, play is necessary for the survival of the individual animal. It's also essential for the survival of the pack itself. So those are the two long-standing hypotheses.
Well, I think you cite one study that showed that bears who play more in their youth have a higher probability of surviving. I mean, do we have any sense of the causal relationship? Because, I mean, this could just be correlational. I mean, you say that play is what you do when you're relaxed. Play is what you do when you're not under threat. So it could just be that the bears that lived a nice, cushy childhood are the ones that live longer, right? I mean, do we know whether that's a causal relationship? Is there a way to test that experimentally? Right? You know, have a subject group and a treatment group where you tell some bears to play and others not to play?
It's, well, as you suggesting, it's pretty difficult to do in the wild. and that study of bear play only found correlation. I suppose the best studies in controlled environments are those done on laboratory rats, and a lot of these were accomplished and are continuing to be accomplished by Sergio and Vivian Pellis, University of Lethbridge in Canada. So it does seem to be the case that young rats that play more are better socialized. As adults, they are, and being a better socialized rat is very important for your survival and reproduction. Rats that are not socialized, these rats that have been disallowed from play, are either too frightened to play with other rats, or they're far too aggressive. So that in between healthy socialized rat is a product of play.
Well, I think you make a distinction between solitary play, object play, and social play, right? And when it comes to things like mating and hunting and figuring out your place in the pecking order and all that, I mean, that's the social play stuff, right? But there's also all this play where, you're bouncing the ball around. You described the octopus, right? It's messing around. I mean, completely by themselves, they're trying to understand the environment. I mean, how much of it is about understanding the physical environment and one's own, I guess, movements and physiological relationships with the environment, and how much of it is about understanding the kind of interconspecific dynamics?
Yeah, these categories of play. I mean, there are, you just mentioned, the three traditional categories of play. One is solitary play, the other is object play, and the last, and in fact, the last to develop often was social play. But the boundaries between these are porous and pretty fuzzy. You might say that solitary play, that is, again, that pony frolicking in the field, is alone in the field, of learning about its body in certainly a very fun way. And you might say the octopuses playing with the ball, or in the experiment conducted by Jennifer Mather and Roland Anderson, playing with pill bottles in a tank of water. We're learning about their things in their environment in a fun way. And again, back to the wolves and rats and dogs, when they social play, are learning about their societies and learning about others. But it could get mixed up, of course. I mean, two dogs play fighting over a stick are learning social play, but also learning the object play.
Uh-huh. And you also tie this into neuroscience and how the way in which the different parts of our brain kind of work together requires some training, right? And there's a feedback loop there. So if that's true, then that would suggest that play deprivation would be harmful. And you speculate about maybe the impact on humans that are deprived of play. Do we have good evidence on that? I mean, I know there's a lot of people who are recognizing kind of the decline of at least some kinds of play in human childhoods in recent decades. The playground is not very populated nowadays, right? I mean, I know this is not the main subject of your book, but is there evidence that kind of humans have more or less play, or does play just kind of get displaced from one domain to another?
I don't know if there's any long-term studies on this at present. The ethologist that I spoke to and wrote about all speculate on it. And certainly we need some studies on this. I think it's most interesting and maybe most overlooked in play studies. And there are many human play studies and an institute of play and a journal of play. But many of these studies overlook, I'd say, what's called rough and tumble play or play fighting. And a number of the ethologists that are featured in the book, Sergio Pellis of the laboratory rat studies, for instance, noticed that on playgrounds these days, that is to say, North American playgrounds, at least, rough and tumble play is discouraged or down and out forbidden. And I think people of a certain generation, my generation, for instance, remember childhoods when rough and tumble play was just a given. You got in scraps when you were a kid, particularly boys, perhaps. And your parents or your guardians, if they knew about it at all, they didn't worry about it all that much. It was just a matter of being a kid. And I know this is a difficult and sensitive area. I certainly recognize that. And this is not in any way to condone bullying, et cetera, but just to say that a certain amount of rough and tumble play, many ethologists, I think, agree is healthy and just fine. All the while being careful and recognizing that it is good perhaps in moderation, but only in moderation.
Mm-hmm. And so what exactly happens with that? I mean, you talk about how the primates and other social animals are kind of testing the boundaries of what is acceptable behavior and what is unacceptable, and figuring out kind of where they sit in the social hierarchy. I mean, it does seem to me to be like experimentation, right? I mean, trying things out, trying to figure out what's transgressive and what's not transgressive.
Yeah, exactly. Rough and tumble play and play fighting may be necessary for animals to learn this. One study of Pellis with the laboratory rats that I found really fascinating is that rat colonies are hierarchical, and there is always a dominant male rat, and the other rats in the colony will play fight with the rat. And play fighting in rats is not like fighting at all. One rat just nuzzles the nape of the other, doesn't bite, doesn't try to break the skin. But if a subordinate rat wanted to challenge the dominant rat, he might begin by engaging in play fighting. And if he wants to test out that dominance, he wants to challenge that dominance, he can do it in a very tricky way. He can bite a little too hard, harder than he would if he were play fighting. Now, if he does, the dominant rat might worry about this for a second and say, uh-oh, maybe we're moving this into a real fight, not sure. And the dominant rat might back off, and the subordinate rat would win this fight, perhaps become dominant. But if the dominant rat doesn't back off, the subordinate rat could just roll over on his back, and say, in effect, oops, didn't mean to bite that hard. So the subordinate rat would have been able to challenge it without looking like he was challenging it. And in a very, very tricky, subtle, perhaps we might say unfair way, have learned to take advantage without really taking advantage. And it's these kinds of behaviors that can only come about in play fighting. So it's good for the colony as a whole that can happen, because the hierarchy has been maintained. but no one has been really harmed. No blood was shed. So so the colony is, as it were, happy.
Well, it seems like we humans, I mean, we do all this with words. I mean, most of our play is verbal. And we do what you just described with words, where you know, maybe rib somebody or ridicule them, and, you know, it can cross a line potentially, and then you have to back off. And you have this great scene, you mentioned that scene from Goodfellas, right, with the Joe Pesci character, right, which, you know, again, if it wasn't verbal, it would look very much like something that could happen in a primate colony, but with physical actions, right? So, I mean, should we be thinking about, you know, verbal play as mapping onto all of these behaviors that we observe in animals with physical play?
Yeah, I think it pretty clearly does. I don't think there's any great distinction. Yeah, we all of us tease with verbal play, and in some cultures and some societies that gets more intense than others. There's in Ireland there's a tradition called slagging, which I find very, very strange, which someone will be teased to the point where he or she is crying. And that just seems rather cruel. But in certain parts of Ireland, it's just a given. It just happens.
Well, it's like roasting, right? So that, you know, there was just this Tom Brady roast, right, on TV. But I remember in law school, in business school, and in the military, they have these kind of theatrical productions where they will ridicule the senior officers or the professors, right? And the professors have to take it, and then every now and then it crosses the line. and there's pushback, and, you know, they might even cancel it for a year or two until you know, people remember where those boundaries are. And there's also like the dozens in African American culture, right? You know, kind of the, you know, yo mama jokes sort of thing. That's another version of this, seeing how far you can push until you encounter some kind of resistance.
Yeah, all those are great examples. I hadn't thought of all that, but yeah, and that hazy area, that boundary area is fascinating. That's really where the action is. That's where the thinking and the reactions have to be really quick, because you have to figure out how serious the other one is. You have to figure out if that was an accident. You have to, you might want to consider the history of your relationship, the very character of the other. You've got to do all of that in a few seconds. Yeah, that's fascinating stuff. That negotiating play and play fighting. That's worth its own book, I think.
Yeah, it does seem also there's a bit of a display element. I mean, you didn't talk about that much in the book, but there's this idea that, you know, humor is a fitness indicator, kind of like a peacock's tail, right? And so, you know, some of these play displays, some of the play stuff that you do, you're kind of doing in front of an audience, and you're demonstrating how comfortable you are with putting yourself at a disadvantage, right?
Yeah. Well, theater is a kind of play. And one area of play that I'm thinking more and more about, I mean, after the book was completed, was improv, improvisation theater.
Yeah, I was totally thinking about improv when you mentioned this whole notion of preparing for the unexpected, right? And you have a whole section on that. I wonder if we could dig into that and then circle it back to, you know, improv, which is the kind of a human verbal version of this.
Yeah, sure. A study of piglets that conducted in the 1980s. These were piglets in the Edinburgh Pig Park, which was a semi-natural enclave. Domestic animals allowed to run wild. And the piglets were spending a lot of time running, and that wasn't surprising to evolutionary biologists because you need to run if you're going to escape a predator. But what was surprising them is the piglets were suddenly performing flop overs. They'd stop running and just perform a flop over, which seemed to have no evolutionary advantage unless you want to become a predator's dinner. After some thought, these ethologists came to agree that the piglets in a natural environment aren't running over even ground. They're running over uneven ground. Then there's going to be stumps, roots, and rocks. So they are necessarily going to, sooner or later, they're going to fall. So these deliberate flop overs, they agreed, were preparation for a fall, and more specifically, learning to recover from a fall. So this was this play behavior that was definitely good for their survival and ultimately reproduction. Yes, so a lot of I think as to improv, something I'm thinking about as I concluded the book, that natural selection has many features. And one feature of natural selection, and Darwin noted this, it seldom works from scratch. It takes an existing feature and changes it, maybe improves it. So for instance, the bones of the hand, if they are, or the bones of a paw, if you will, if they are lengthened and lightened and hollowed, they become the bones of a bird's wing. But the fundamental structure is the same. They're the same number. They are the same relation to each other. Or they become the bones of a whale's fin. Same thing. Same number, same relation between them. So natural selection does not work, doesn't invent things from scratch. Very often it just changes things. And that's exactly what improv does. With improv, we all know the rule of improv is yes and. And that is, it seems to me, it's natural selection is also yes and.
Yes, I mean, as these pigs will sort of cause themselves to fall in some random way, right, to be prepared for anything. I mean, we do the same things with our words. I mean, sometimes wade into a conversation where we have no idea what the response is, or throw up some random comment just to kind of see how people respond to it, and so conversation can be extremely playful. And I mean, I had a podcast recently where we were discussing the extent to which people appreciate unscripted behavior better than they appreciate scripted behavior, right? So if we think a musician is improvising, we're more impressed than if they are kind of playing from a score. I mean, is that because we, there's something, I guess, fitness enhancing about the ability to respond to these random stressors?
I don't know, but that certainly sounds reasonable. There are whole areas of art that are improvisation, jazz, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking personally for a moment, sometimes I think the best part of a theatrical production is seeing an actor recover,
Mm-hmm.
maybe forgetting a line or skipping a beat and coming back from that. I mean, that's what I leave the theater thinking about and talking about and admiring. So yeah, I didn't quite connect with this until now, but yeah, maybe that piglet flop over moment is the most exciting.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we're worried about anthropomorphizing when we look at these animals playing, and we find it really cute. I mean, I think if you look at the number of memes that are circulating in social media of animals doing cute things. I mean, do we run the risk of anthropomorphizing when we see them do this? I mean, does it make sense to say that they're having fun?
Well, I think it does make sense to say they're having fun. The uh, the the issue of anthropomorphizing animals generally and animals play is been debated and gone back and forth a lot of the 20th century. Um, uh, I I think it's interesting that Darwin and his contemporaries and his protege George Romanes assumed that animals had inner lives. To them, it was inherently obvious. Um, Much of the 20th century, um, the that assumption was more or less put away. You can't prove animals have inner lives, therefore let's not make that assumption. Um, but at the same time, um, some thought this was a particularly Western idea, and we'd gone a little too far there. And many moved back to the assumption. Many went back to what David Hume, the philosopher, um, who the great lover of dogs and animals, um, said it was pretty obvious that animals had inner lives. So did Darwin. Um, but we might still be anthropomorphizing sometimes, maybe some details of it. It's really hard to know. And Gordon Burkhardt has maybe one of the leading theorists and thinkers of animal play, has suggested we could moderate this. We could anthropomorphize, but also watch ourselves as we're anthropomorphizing. Um, uh, and the recently deceased Franz de Waal introduced a term he called anthropodenial, by which he meant uh, we moved a little too far in the other direction, and we see animals acting the way we do. Let's allow that they probably are doing it for the same reasons.
Well, you also unearth some lesser known biologists and ethologists, like this guy Romanes. Why don't we know his name?
Well, we do. Why don't we know Romanes's name? He One reason might be in his day, in his lifetime, he was a bit discredited by his contemporaries, who said he was not. He wrote a book on animal inner lives, and much of the information he collected, some thought were not from the best sources. Some thought were far too anecdotal. It wasn't. He wasn't practicing what you'd call good data science. He was using small samples and maybe not checking the sources enough. That said, he was a protege and friend of Darwin, and his books are worth reading, and also say perhaps ironically is the word here. Many of the accounts he wrote about have been witnessed. I mean, many of the animal behavior he wrote about has been witnessed by ethologists in animal behavior sense. So, in the long run, Romanes wins, I guess.
Well, you also talk about Baldwin and how Baldwin was also kind of banished, right, until he was rehabilitated after his death with this idea of organic evolution. How do you distinguish that from Lamarckianism?
It's one way to distinguish Baldwin's organic evolution is that it's more focused than Lamarckianism. The Lamarckianism is universal in the animal. Like the standard example, Lamarck's own was that giraffes have long necks because one generation tried to stretch its neck, reaching for leaves and upper branches. And that stretched neck, or let's say the genes of that stretched neck, were passed on to the next generation, and the next, and the next, and the next. Now, that isn't how natural selection works at all, and that isn't how genetics works. But Baldwin has introduced an idea by which he said there is no way an animal can affect its own evolution. So here's an example. Suppose we have a population of cottontail rabbits, and they run in, and one of the rabbits learns to run in zigzags, and foxes cannot run in zigzags easily. So the rabbit escapes the fox, lives long enough to reproduce, and we leave that population alone for a few generations. We come back many years later, and all the rabbits are running in zigzags, and the population's increased. So natural selection would say, okay, that's a behavior that was naturally selected. Fine, some neural network or some combination of musculature and neural networks allowed the rabbits to run in zigzags, and that was improved over generations. Natural selection, fine. Baldwin would come back and say, wait a minute, there was actually will involved in this, because that first rabbit to run in zigzags made a choice. That first rabbit said, I'm going to run in zigzags. And if that rabbit hadn't done it, you would not have had other rabbits doing it. And you would not have had ultimately that increase in population. So that's Baldwin's organic selection introduces or reintroduces will at free will into natural selection.
So the idea is that the traits that enable us to learn these new methods will survive disproportionately, right? If those new methods are useful. I mean, is that sort of explain our kind of propensity to engage in play? I mean, it seems like humans have this capacity on steroids. I mean, I think you couldn't write a book like this without referencing Huizinga and Homo ludens. I mean, it does seem like if play is something that all animals do, humans have taken it to new levels. I mean, we are, some of us are playing all the time, 24 hours a day almost. And I think, whereas animals, it seems like they spend part of their time doing it, and maybe as they get older, they phase it out entirely. But it seems like humans are capable of playing all the way until death.
Yeah, humans probably are the most playful animals, and as to playing as one ages, many animals, adult animals continue to play. If they continue to play, it's often social play.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be because a younger object play and solitary play answer all of the educational needs of younger animals. You don't need, by the time you're an adult, you've controlled the body enough and you control your environment enough, but you still haven't controlled others around you. So you still may need the social play. So that's one advantage, perhaps, of it. But yeah, humans, we have developed all manner of play, and incredibly complex play and all kinds of games and all kinds of ways. And uh, many of us, I think, are playing most of the time. Even what we call work is play.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I mean, seriously, I mean, what you and I are doing right now, I think, is play.
Right. So we should lean into that. Well, look, I wanted to ask you about teaching nonfiction. You're in an English department, not in a journalism school, but you write nonfiction. How common is it for people to be nonfiction writers in English departments?
I think it's still not quite common, not as the main purview. A number of my colleagues um, self-identify um, as poets of fiction, that is. And yet they do write nonfiction on occasion. So I'm a little bit of an outlier in that I write nonfiction exclusively.
And do you think that writing nonfiction is also a type of play in the same way that writing fiction is? Do you see yourself as doing something that's fundamentally similar to what the fiction writers are doing?
Yeah, I think it is. It's it's a bit different in some ways, but it is a play. Yes. Most of my job is hardly a job. It's play. I'm engaging with others. These are conversations that give and take. There is all the features in play, I think, are present. I'm in my work. Gordon Burkhart's list really describes my work. And in fact, I think it describes the work of a lot of people right now.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was Herbert Spencer that said that used this term vitality. I mean, is it seems like play is a way for us to experience this vitality, right? This superfluity of energy that we might have.
Yeah, play and natural selection seem to have quite a lot in common. They are both provisional and open-ended. They both balance competition and cooperation, and so on and so forth. So many features of natural selection are also features of play. And if you could push this, and I do push this a bit further, and say natural selection is the defining feature of life. You can say, well, life is something that grows, it consumes, and it dies, but the same can be said of stars or candle flames. You could say that life reproduces, but the same could be said of crystals. The thing that characterizes life that does not characterize candle flames or stars or crystals is that it evolved by natural selection. So if natural selection and play share features, then I don't think it's going too far to say that life is fundamentally playful.
And so if there were a creator, he would be playing through evolution, presumably.
That's a fascinating question. Genesis chapter 1, when God in Genesis chapter 1 is acting provisionally, he does not make things good. He makes things and then he judges them good. That's the litany through that whole chapter 1. First he makes something, then he judges it good. So he does seem to be improvising.
Right.
And one might say, and I would even say playing. And when I use play here, I'm being very serious about it. Play is serious stuff.
Yeah. Well, David, thanks so much. The book is called Kingdom of Play. Stories of octopuses, monkeys, elephants, meerkats, and also those creatures called humans. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.